Welcome to For Impact, the charity podcast. We're here to give voice to the sector and talk about the taboos and challenges holding it back and what we can do about it. Our topic today is From Founder to Saboteur, the reality behind founder's syndrome in our sector. I'm Felicia Willow, founder of Interims for Impact and a charity specialist consultant. I work directly with charities on strategy, governance and crisis, and also increasingly work across the sector to address the systemic issues that hold For Impact organisations back. I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Pitt from the Benefact Group.
Hi, Felicia, and hello, everyone. Good to be here.
So founder's syndrome is a recognised problem in our sector, but there is more to the story. Why is it so prevalent and what can be done? And also, what should founders do if they recognise some of these behaviours in themselves? So in this episode, we examine how control, identity and power can shift founders from driving impact to creating risk or worse, and how these dynamics are often enabled rather than challenged.
Well, this is another fascinating topic, and I should open with saying that we do love founders at Benefact. In our time providing charity support, we've quickly recognised how impressive and powerful, how amazing founders are. And that's why we've set up founders forums, getting founders together for learning, reflection and support. But I recognise that we are seeing the very best of the founder community. As wonderful as founders are, I'm realising that they can also go bad.
Absolutely. Every charity needs to be founded somehow. Our sector is built on founders. And it's really important to emphasise at the outset that this episode is not anti-founder. You know, some of the healthiest and most impactful organisations I've worked with were founded by people with enormous vision and who also knew how to build challenge around themselves. But founder syndrome is real and we do need to talk about it. I wanted to do this episode because I come across founder syndrome quite a bit in my work as both a consultant and also through Interims for Impact. And it is a sensitive subject for many, especially founders. But like all other topics we approach in this podcast, we need to break this taboo, as when founder syndrome comes into play, it can have extremely negative consequences.
Yeah, I guess it is an issue we've got to get into. When I was reflecting on this, I think that in some ways, founders' syndrome issues are just leadership challenges. You know, you can find passionate leaders everywhere who aren't necessarily very functional. But I think this is particularly important and damaging, potentially, because the impact is intensified with founders. They are so intimately interwoven with the charity they've established. So, although I started thinking about this, it isn't just a poorly performing leadership challenge. It is much deeper than that.
It really can be. I mean, last year, I actually encountered the most extreme founder syndrome situation of my career, to the point where I actually made my first ever whistleblowing referral to the Charity Commission. Keeping in mind, I have worked at the coalface of charity crises for more than a decade, and I have never done that before. So this was the most shocking example I've seen, from extreme conflicts of interest at the board and leadership levels, misuse of funds, abuse and bullying of staff, even the unlawful removal of trustees by a compromised member on the board. So these dynamics can become quite extreme and deeply damaging, both for staff and ultimately the people organisations exist to serve.
I'm shuffling in my seat here. I'm getting that familiar, uncomfortable feeling I get on these podcasts, which must mean that we're talking about the right issues. And I think there's a reason that I've seen founders syndrome also coined founderitis. It's not a condition that anyone wants to get. And yeah, we've got a responsibility to shine a light on it.
And in doing so, let's bring in our guests. So today we're speaking with Dr. Susanna Kislenko, an academic specialising in founder leadership and founder syndrome; Carla Gill, a former founder now working with others through transition; and Mona Vadher and Nick Moore, two Interims for Impact associates who, as interim CEOs, have seen firsthand the impact some of these situations can have on organisations' culture and governance. Let's get cracking.
My name is Susanna Kislenko, and I'm the director of the Founder Leadership Research Lab at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. And I'm a social psychologist, and I study the way that founders lead long term.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I know you've done a lot of research into this. And so a question I really want to ask you is, when does effective founder leadership stop being an asset and start becoming what we call founders syndrome?
Yeah, I have found that there's a critical threshold moment, and it's basically right after the startup or the founding period. So the organization is around, it exists, it's off and running, and it's just at that pivotal point when organizations are about to scale or about to go to the next level, where the kind of leadership that's required is often very different than regular quote unquote founder leadership that we see as being very effective in the beginning. And there are certain skills that a founder needs to get something off the ground, to get people behind them, all that kind of stuff. But often those very same skills are what work against them when we're talking about long term founder leadership.
It's funny, I've worked with some brilliant founders over the years, and I do find that some people find the term founder syndrome triggering or offensive. And I think the thing is, it is used loosely quite often. So, what are the actual warning signs that this is more than just, say, a passionate or a dominant founder? What is it that makes it founder's syndrome?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's true. There are some things that aren't necessarily red flags, but that can become red flags toward the founder syndrome side when they're combined with other things. So, for example, charisma, I would say, is something that is in one way a neutral element because you need a certain level of charisma to get the organization off the ground and get funding and all that kind of stuff. However, when charisma is combined with the desire to control the organization at all levels, at all costs, in every single way, that's when the elements of founder syndrome come into play. And so some of the features, let's say, include extreme micromanagement, not being able to delegate, not having a succession plan, sabotaging other employees. I would say there's an element of that. So, in the most extreme cases of founder syndrome, what I've seen is the founder wants to remain at the center. And so, if there's ever anyone who threatens that for them, they will start to demean them and bring them down.
So, in your research, what is it that makes founder led charities especially vulnerable to poor governance or unhealthy power dynamics?
Yeah, there was a study that I did in Canada with Imagine Canada, an organization there, and my co author, Kathy Barr, where we talked specifically to nonprofit founders and nonprofit board chairs to try to understand some of these dynamics. And what we found there was that of course, there's an element that is related to the mission, but the real pain, or I don't even want to say pain point, maybe like challenging moment happens when sometimes founders intentionally bring on board members, knowing that those board members will never say no to the founder. And what's more is if the board members or if the governance structure is so much focused around the founder and around the mission, sometimes board members themselves might not take initiative to educate themselves about what their roles are really supposed to be, what their responsibilities are supposed to be, and just kind of will rubber stamp anything that the founder says. And in the long term, that doesn't work to the advantage of either the board or the organization. And in my view, the founder themselves either.
One of the conversations we had before was about how founders can sometimes become highly performative around accountability or succession. And I thought that was really fascinating. So, what does false reform look like in practice? And how can boards tell the difference between kind of theatre and genuine change?
Um, love the term theater and love the term force reform is a really is an interesting topic here. First of all, let me just say it's tricky. It's not straightforward. And I think that the founders that have gotten good at that kind of performative action can be very good at it. So it can be very hard to spot. But the main thing I would say is it's when the words are not aligning with the actions or when whatever's written down in the plan doesn't play out. And if you really start to pay attention, and I would say ask the good questions, because that's what's sometimes tricky for people is to really dig in there, you will see the signs. You will see the signs of what's really happening. For example, if a founder says, okay, we have a 5-year succession plan, but then 2 years in, no one's heard of any action or anything, anything at all. Like one of the trickiest parts with founder syndrome is the founder will hold all the information in their mind. And that is by design so that no one else can hold the information. But of course, if we're preparing for succession in any earnest way, we need to document, right? We need to be able to pass on documents and pass on instructions. And so if none of that is happening, for example, That's a sure sign that maybe actual succession planning is not happening.
I had that exact experience as a trustee on a board, and the chair of the board was great friends with the outgoing founder. And we try and set standards as a board and say, right, they need to do this by next meeting. And the chair would come back and say, yeah, I raised it with them. And said he wouldn't do it. And it was just like, it's really frustrating. And I think this is the thing, we do see boards in these situations making a lot of mistakes. It may be because they admire the founder, or they've got loyalty to them, or they're brought in because they're great friends, or they might fear damaging the organization. If you say the founder has got everything in their mind, like what happens if they suddenly walk out the door? So what are the kind of the biggest mistakes you've seen boards make in these founder-led charities?
Ooh, how much time do we have? Because the thing is, I think what's so challenging sometimes in these kinds of settings is a lot can be overlooked for the cause. What I've seen that is the hardest to tease apart is when there are justifications being made for, I don't even want to say mistakes, but just for things that don't feel right or things that don't feel aligned. But then the founder might come in, tell another lovely story from the ground or from something that's going on, within the organization, and it will be forgotten. So, yeah, I think some of the stories like that I have end up being around justifying or finding ways around facts, around things that are really hard to debate, but people will go to bat to back up the founder. And I think that, if you find yourself doing that too much, I would question why.
I see a lot of multiple chances given as well. Like we'll just, they've said they we'll, just give them a bit more time. And I think, there is often a feeling of powerlessness that I hear, sometimes from individual trustees, sometimes, often from employees in these situations. So who do you think actually has the power to influence these situations when you have full blown founder syndrome going on?
Wonderful question. I've been on that investigation now for over a decade because I used to think I started with founders themselves actually when I started, doing this kind of research. And then I started to think the employees, then I started to think board members, and now where I've landed is funders. So the way I see it is everyone is a piece of the puzzle. And, I've noticed in my research is basically a social structure that gets created around founder syndrome founders that I call the founder pedestal. And it's basically exists to protect their image. And there's various layers of people within that social structure that are, yeah, are working to make sure things stay status quo. So I think the board has an important role to play. Employees in a forum have a role to play, but more and more, I think it's with funders. And in fact, I'm about to start a research project looking at how primarily foundations work with the founders that they select to support and how that plays out long term. Because my hunch is funders have a lot more power, I want to say, but it's deeper than power, influence than they might realize around these questions. And sometimes I know funders might not want to get involved with organizational decisions or organizational activities, but I think there can be a form of influence that is indirect and that can make a big impact.
There was a case that you and I have had a conversation about separately of quite an extreme situation. I was very frustrated that the funder hadn't taken action. And in recent weeks, they now have. But unfortunately, it's kind of too little too late because they've just cut off all funding. And I really look at that situation and think they could have actually resolved it so the organization could have thrived and continued. But instead, they left it too late and then went nuclear. So it's frustrating. And I'm often frustrated about how much power funders have, but this is a situation in which they can use it for the good. And another thing I think that is really interesting that you've said before is about sometimes the futility of trying to reform some of these situations. So at what point does trying to reform a founder-led organization become basically self-deception for staff or consultants or trustees trying to turn things around?
Well, here's what I will say on that question. Self deception is a really multi layered thing. And we are all capable of it for different reasons and at various levels and in various forms. And the more I do this research, the more I think about intuition, and the more I think about the things that you always realize you knew after the fact, when something goes down and you think, I had that hunch, right? I knew something was off and I pulled myself back or I didn't say anything. And so I think it becomes self deception when you've got something within you that's saying something's off and you don't do anything about it or you don't explore it further or you don't talk about it with someone else. One of the studies I'm currently in the midst of is a whistleblowing study that I know we've spoken about. And in doing those interviews and doing that data collection, one of the things we're looking at is the different stages of sort of when people decide to possibly share something with someone and, then continue to take it up. And what I'm finding fascinating is how much people can talk themselves out of sharing at all, even though they have so much evidence and they feel it strongly within themselves. And they may have spoken with one person very close to them, and then they pull back. And then they think, it's just me. I'm probably making it up, right? I'm probably imagining it, dot, dot, dot. Because one of the very damaging things, I think, in these kinds of settings that we're talking about is there's a false reality that is created, like in a cult structure, like in the emperor has no clothes kind of structure. And so if you're the person thinking, wait a minute, the emperor has no clothes or the empress has no clothes, but you're the only one, you might pull back, right? And say, and talk yourself out of it. One of the most common questions I get when talking about founder syndrome is, well, then are all founders like this? And, of course, the answer is absolutely not. And in fact, I wish I didn't have to be doing this research. That is the real truth, right? Like, I only ended up as a researcher because this, yeah, I encountered this in the nonprofit sector in Canada, and then couldn't believe that there wasn't more information on it or more research and more digging and more conversations about it. And so because my goal is for my research to inspire conversations about these uncomfortable topics, I think, we need to look at the whole picture. It can't be just one or the other. But the reason why I go deep in this kind of topic is because we have so little information about it and people are scared to address it. People are scared to talk about it. I also love founders, even though I study founder syndrome, because I know the value of founders in our society. I know we need these kinds of personalities. It's just, can we also get honest about the fact that just because you're someone who has the skills to start something doesn't mean that you are above other human beings or that you are automatically a quote unquote genius or that dot dot dot, right? Because I think, because to me, that's where the issues arise when we societally put founders on a pedestal and therefore grant founders, just because they're the parents of the organization, these incredible, yeah, just powers really that maybe no human really is supposed to have. And I think we've now had so many cases all over the world that speak to the fact that we cannot ignore this anymore. And I think particularly in the nonprofit or charity sector, people are scared to question the leaders that are associated with a noble cause or whatever it might be, right? So, and that's what I think we need to be shaken out of is everyone is just a person, and there's all kinds of people, and we get it right and we get it wrong, and we all need support of various kinds, right? And so
And we all need to be held to account.
ding ding ding, I couldn't agree more, right?
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate your input.
My true and great pleasure, Felicia.
Hi, I'm Carla. I'm a charity coach and consultant, specialising in supporting charity founders, both within and beyond the organisation that they've founded.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's fantastic to have you. Now, to get the first thing out of the way before we do anything else is I understand you are not a fan of the term founders syndrome. So can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, and I guess it's not necessarily that I'm not so much of a fan. I completely acknowledge the merit of it, because actually by having the term founder syndrome, it means that it is an acknowledged issue. But I feel that it oversimplifies the problem. It blames just the founder. It puts blame on just one person. So it misses out all of the societal pressures, the fact that there might be inexperienced boards, people are sort of enabling that founder, and often there's impossible expectations. And also that there's often trauma and a lot connected within that space as well. So it's not that I don't like the phrase founder syndrome. I think it's actually has value, but I think it is a bigger problem than just, oh, the founder is a pain. It's wider than that.
Yeah. So, in your experience, obviously, you've worked with a lot of founders and you've been a founder yourself as well. When do you think founder behavior moves from, understandable pressure into something that is actively harmful to the organization?
I don't think founders are ever sort of actively harming or consciously actively harming their organization. I think actually it comes down to them drowning and not knowing where to let go of and not being able to ask for help, and often being put on a pedestal for so long that actually create this quite vulnerable space. And so everything becomes quite personal. Something I work a lot with founders on is where do they end and where does the organization begin? Because identity tends to be so tightly connected there that it's almost impossible. So when someone says, oh, this piece of work isn't good enough, it becomes a personal attack and actually isn't. And the founder sort of struggles to see that actually it's not about them. It's just actually that maybe they haven't got the skill set within that space and maybe someone else would be better to do with it. There's also a case of, there's a lot of enablers. You're put on a huge pedestal by people that maybe don't know huge amounts about the whole situation. So it can be really complicated. So I feel like there's more to it than someone just sabotaging the organisation that they founded.
And so when founder behavior does become harmful for whatever reason, who should be responsible for kind of calling that out and dealing with it? And why is it that so often seems to fail?
I think, first of all, I think everyone is responsible, not just the founder and the people within the organisation, but actually their friends and family, people that know them, other charity professionals that have come across them. It's everybody's responsibility because, as I say, I see it as a societal issue. So I think everyone's responsible for that. And I think why it often fails, or why founders can sometimes find themselves in the situation where they feel like they're acting on best interest of the organisation, but people around them don't. It's because actually they've often lived in quite an echo chamber. So in order to get stuff done, some people can end up quite head down and crack on kind of mindset. And, well, no one else is fixing this problem. I'm the only one dealing with this problem. So I just need to run at 1,000,000 miles an hour and make this happen, regardless of what the fallout of it is. So when you've been running like that for a long time with that mindset, it can be really hard to step back and go, oh, hang on, is this still the right direction? And so it often fails when people call someone out on founder syndrome because that person has been so headstrong for so long that they haven't been able to see the bigger picture. And so I think the key to it is ensuring there's critical friends from day one. So making sure that the founders are surrounded by lots of different people with different opinions to help almost take those blinkers off and see that there's lots of different ways to go around things.
In some of the situations I've seen where there has been really problematic behavior, so not the successful founders who I think do that absolutely, but ones where they create that echo chamber, it does feel like, boards are populated with friends and family or these kind of intertwined networks of loyalty that can make it very difficult to get action. But is that a system failure? Is that a failure of the founder to create that space and opportunity for challenge as they set up their organization?
I think it's a bit of both. Because, as I say, as a founder, the difference with a founder is everyone experiences issues in life. The difference is that a founder sees the problem and decides that setting up a charity is the answer or something that can help resolve that problem. So they have taken action. And so it's about, in that early stages, they often just want people just to get on board and they just need access to people, so that the board come along, they are friends and family, like that's nearly what always happens. So I think actually the communication in wider society, so the training that you can go on as small charity leaders and things like that, all of that needs to be around professionalising the board, which I know, pretty much everything is. Everyone talks about professional board, but it's about that wider piece and helping that person get out into society more broadly. And also it's maybe not necessarily an issue it is an issue for the charity, but it's also the wider society. So we tend to have quite, if you don't work in the charity sector, that you can have quite polarized opinions on the charity sector. It can be, oh, well, everyone's a saint. Everyone is absolutely amazing and they just must be the most wonderful people in the world. I could never be like them. Or it's, well, they're just all, or it's like, oh, they're taking all the money and they shouldn't be paid, this, that and the other. Obviously, there is a huge amount of people in the middle as well. I'm absolutely exaggerating. But, and when I used to go out and, I set up a charity in my 20s, I call it the ignorance of youth, setting up the charity that I did. But I used to go to parties and I think, I just can't tell another person what I do because I'd get one polarised opinion or the other. So I used to just tell people that I worked at Wagamama's because I was like, that's just easier. So it's not just the space that the charity sector creates, it's sort of wider society as well, which obviously is a massive entity to shift. But all of that pedestal stuff really impacts, I think, a charity founder, particularly when they've set something up through something that feels very personal and very traumatic, which is generally the reason why people found an organisation.
I think that's one of the things that does make it different from, you see entrepreneurs who are very successful at starting stuff up and knowing exactly the moment to bring in the different type of CEO who can run and build and scale something. Whereas with charity founders, that can often be a period, it seems, where there's a struggle to bring in the right CEO for the next phase of the charity. So when you've seen situations when a founder is no longer the right leader, how can a new type of CEO be successfully transitioned into that role?
If I just take a step back on that question, the comparison between business entrepreneurs and charity founders is when a charity founder steps down from, if they are in a paid CEO role, they're effectively being made unemployed. So when I set up the charity that I did, I ran it for the same amount of time as my other half's best friend who set up a business. And at the same time, the same year, had about the same turnover. He sold his business. He never had to work a day in his life. I became unemployed, which I have no issues with whatsoever. That's absolutely fine. I knew what I was getting myself into. But that is a factor to consider, that actually and this is what I mean by identity, it's such a lot tied into it that is really complicated. And not saying that the founders should be paid when they move on from their organisation, but there's a lot more to it. So I think that success, comes down to, there's a few things that I often say when charity founders move on. One is that if you're going to leave. Don't hang around. If you're a paid CEO and you've decided actually that's the time, or the board, or together you've decided it's time to move on, don't step down from a CEO and become a trustee. Or don't step down from the CEO role and just pop into the office every Friday. You're leaving. The role as a founder is to set up an organisation. Beyond that, you then are employed. If you are employed as a CEO, or if you're the chair, but you then take on that role. So your role as founder has actually almost ceased to exist because you have done the founder role in the real practicalities of it. So if you're going to leave, then you need to really leave and ensure that communication between yourself and the charity that you founded is kind of contracted. So making sure that the organisation knows, if you want to, that they can get in touch with you to, I don't know, if they want you to do a speaking event, or to do some fundraising or some advice on a programme that you set up or whatnot. But equally, it's contracted that they will get in touch with you, not that you will get in touch with them. Maybe you get the newsletters, you have a nice relationship with the chair or whatever, but you're not coming in and out of that organisation, because that can really cause trouble for both the organisation and the founder to move forward.
Especially, please don't move straight onto the board. It's nothing worse than being the CEO or the interim CEO when the founder has gone from being the CEO to becoming a trustee.
Absolutely. And you wouldn't do that as a CEO. If you just got a job as a CEO in an organisation that you didn't found, you wouldn't leave that CEO job and become become on the board.
Did happen to me once in one of my jobs, and the person had been completely incompetent, and it was really awkward to go to board meetings and have to fix everything.
As I said that, I was like, it does happen, but equally shouldn't happen. Well, not shouldn't,
happen.
but it's just,
No,
it's a tricky...
Have a break at least.
Yeah. Take a moment, take a break.
Take a couple of years, give the CEO time to bed in. Like, just don't do it, everybody. That's free advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say it's about treating yourself like any other departing employee and ensuring that the board also treat you as any other departing employee. You need a handover. And I say that with the addition of course, there's going to be more emotional attachment. So, there'll be other things as well. So maybe your leaving party might be a little bit more of a thing, how you communicate, how you're going to move on from the organisation will be more of a consideration, because there is likely to be funders that are there because they've got that personal connection with you as well. But again, that's about building up that sustainable organisation that those funders have great relationship with other members of the team and that they are invested in the organisation, not so much you. But the thing that actually I think is critical almost before you get to the point of, okay, practicality, how am I going to hand this thing over, is your identity. Is, okay, who am I? Who am I without this organisation? And it might not be a case of looking back before you founded the organisation, because you might have founded the organisation based on a life-changing experience, and therefore that's kind of null and void to go back. But what is the organisation giving you currently that if you stepped away from it, you wouldn't be receiving anymore? Where are you going to seek that? Do you still need it? What's important to you? How are you going to fill your time? What are your skills, actually? Because most charity founders, they are really good at setting things up. But do you actually have the skill set, or do you actually like running an organisation? Some, not really, because actually then they have to deal with all the other stuff they're not interested in, So actually, are you really good at programs? Are you really good at identifying the impact? Are you really good at engaging people, campaigning? What is it that you like? So what's your piece next? So I think founders often spend a lot of time concerned about how the organisation will survive without them. But actually, we need to spend as much time, if not more, on how is that founder going to survive beyond the organisation. I remember it feeling such a big entity to leave. And I thought, oh God, when we tell everyone, they're going to be like, what? No one really cared. In a nice way, in a really nice way. Everyone's just really happy for us. Went, oh, that's great. That's really cool. What you can do next? I don't know. But, you think because it's such a huge part of your life that it's going to be this massive bombshell. But it isn't always. And actually, your friends and family around you just care and just want the best for you. And actually, maybe being out of the organisation that you founded might be the best thing for you. So the final thing that I would say as well is there is no perfect time to leave. I left the organisation I founded in the middle of COVID. That was far from ideal, but I was completely and utterly burnt out and I needed to leave. I wasn't giving the organisation anything anymore. And for both of our sake, I needed to move on. And so we all want to leave on a high. We all want to leave on, that funding coming in, that award having come in, that big accolade or whatever. But if you're in the charity sector, you know that it's a whole roller coaster of ups and downs. And so if you plan only to leave when the organisation is absolutely at its peak, you never will. And when it's great, do you really want to leave when it's great? Because, it's actually quite good. And then when it's terrible, you want to leave, but you don't feel like you can leave. So all of these things all tie in together. So I always say to people, if you feel that fire inside your belly diminishing, if you feel that you can't give what you used to be able to give anymore, then let's look at what you want to achieve and let's put a time frame on it and say, actually, within the next year, 18 months, could be 5 years, who knows? Maybe not 5 years. But let's put a date on it and let's work towards that. What needs to happen for you to be able to move on and you both be able to move on in different directions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Carla. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now on the podcast, really excited to welcome two of our Interims for Impact associates. I'll let them introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Mona. I'm an interim CEO and COO and culture and strategy consultant supporting charities to navigate change, strengthen governance, and build aligned sustainable organisations that hopefully deliver meaningful impact.
Yeah, and hi, my name is Nick Moore. I'm an interim leader and consultant within the charity sector. I've previously served 10 years as a senior leader with a national charity and did 15 years in the commercial world before that.
Lovely. Well, you've both worked in a number of organisations with founders as a consultant, as an interim CEO. And of course, not all of those have had founder syndrome. I think it's important to note. But could you both share something about those that have? Do you find they're all the same or do they differ?
So from my perspective, I found that actually they're not all the same, but there are definitely some recognizable patterns. So both as an interim executive and a consultant, I've worked with 4 founders, and in my opinion and my experience, it's often rooted in this deep commitment and identity, because ultimately founders have built something from the ground up. So it's really, really personal. But I suppose where it differs and how this shows up is around the control and staying close to the decisions. Sometimes it's about trust. And I found myself as a CEO having to build trust with the founder pretty quickly so they can rescind some of the ties they've had. And often it's about they find it very hard to let go as the organization goes through a transition and growth phase. So I've always worked with founders who are both very reflective and open to challenge, but sometimes that shift is harder. So often it's about self-awareness and support rather than having a single type. For me, it's less about labeling, but sort of understanding what's driving it. And I found that people-centric approach definitely worked in my favour, particularly when I found it pretty difficult to transition and the role that they had within the hold they had within the board.
I agree with Mona. I think in some of my experiences as well, Felicia, certainly one of the commonalities is often a really strong sense of cause and purpose, because that founder has gone to a lot of effort to found that charity and to really imbue it with their passion and so on. But also what that often leads to is a failure to invest in proper infrastructure, so the charity may grow quite quickly. It's very reliant on the founder who's busy sorting out all the problems, which they may do themselves or they may bring other people around them. But what they don't not necessarily do then is build systems and infrastructure to depersonalize it and to sort of take capacity forward in the future.
So in those kind of situations where you've kind of encountered founder syndrome, what impact have you seen having a founder who has founder syndrome has had on the charities you've worked with?
I think there's a few I could probably point to. I think probably one of the areas to generalise is that actually probably the drive and creativity needed to start a charity is quite often not the same as the skills and the knowledge needed to continue leading it forwards. That perhaps feeds back to what I just said about not building infrastructure. But what that means is that then it causes problems with the design of services, but also managing other staff and managing finances. So charities are quite often under a bit of a burden around compliance. And if you're a sort of entrepreneurial leader who started a charity and just wants to get out there and serve people, I've seen founders then really struggle with the compliance side because they see this kind of bureaucracy as something that just is a distraction and holds everything back and so on. And I've seen some staff really at loggerheads when I came in as an interim CEO at one point, and the founder CEO recognised they couldn't handle that and had stepped away from it. But it didn't change the fact that there was a 3-way formal grievance going on. The charity was paralysed. They were reliant on recruiting and training volunteers, which they'd stopped doing DBS checks just because of an argument between 2 members of staff about how to record the data, and all those things can sort of come together just because someone who builds a charity isn't necessarily got the right skills to embed it and take it forward.
A few of our guests today have been talking about the governance challenges and the thing that often comes along with founder syndrome in terms of having a board that doesn't adequately challenge the founder. Have you seen those kind of common governance issues across the organisations you've worked with that are struggling with these kind of things?
In my experience, that's almost the consistent thing. The biggest issue is around those blurred boundaries between the founder, the executive, and the board, particularly when the founder still holds that informal power beyond their formal role. So the governance exists, but it's not always fully lived. I've also seen boards struggle to provide appropriate challenge, and this can make ineffective decisions, and it can actually stagnate the growth or even the general day-to-day doing of the organisation. So especially the case when there's a strong relational dynamic with the founder, boards are then very hesitant to challenge, often because of the founder's history or influence. And then often, in my experience as well, and I've worked with 4 of them now, the board is usually recruited by the founder as well. So there is that kind of personal connection, which then doesn't bode well when it comes to some of this objective challenge that you need in order to make these clear decision-making structures happen. So things become very personality-led rather than role-led, and this is where usually the tension sits.
I agree wholeheartedly really with what Mona's just said. I've worked with at least 2 charities where the founder and their partner, one was the CEO and the other one was a trustee, and they were quite different dynamics, but they both ended up at the same point, which was conflict of interest were very difficult to manage. And I think Mona's phrase about blurring of the lines is perfect, because what you find, or what I've found was, and the staff began to know it as well, that there were certain decisions being taken over the breakfast table, we felt, of the founders, and if you asked either of them, was this the CEO and a member of the board talking or not, that they would have struggled themselves then probably to work out where those lay, because to them it was just a natural conversation about this charity that they had founded and really cared about. And I think that can lead then to other compliance issues as well. In that situation, I had to lead the first audit after the founder wasn't involved, and I sat there with an audit partner with their mouth wide open, because some of the things I was disclosing, they were saying, well, why didn't anyone disclose this last year? And that was again about family members being employed or being in like leading roles or whatever, and so on.
And even to call out, I think, some of those relationships, just thinking about some of the loyalty relationships I've seen over the years. One organization I worked with, the founder was actually on the board there, but it was almost like all of their potential business partners ended up serving on the board. So there was all these very intricate financial interests that were at play. And another one I worked with where the founder, again, they were the chair and the treasurer and the major donor, and everyone on the board was someone who either currently worked for them or had previously worked for them or had some other obligation. And it was, as you can imagine, you don't get challenge in those situations where there's all these intricate relationships. And, obviously I've seen in more recent months issues where people have felt an obligation to someone else on the board, and that has influenced the founder. And these things are quite difficult to call out sometimes. I think the being married one is just obviously it's a breach of a constitution. You can say that's that's not allowed. But for these other ones, when you're saying this conflict of interest, it's subtle, but it's affecting how you behave. That can be a really tricky thing, I think, to call out and say, this is not independent. This is not, you're not actually free of an conflict of interest here. So it's tricky, isn't it? So, trustees obviously have a huge role to play in this situation. And I think, I've certainly seen the situations where things have moved on have often been where boards have stepped up. What would you advise trustees or boards who are listening to this about what they should do if they're dealing in this kind of situation?
I think one of the first things, it seems obvious to say it, but as soon as someone registers a charity, it is no longer any individuals. It's no longer the founders. It is now an institution and a separate legal body in its own right. And no matter how passionate the founders are or how effective they are actually, and one of the reasons we're having this conversation is because so many founders have founded charities that have then thrived and grown, but then they've needed some help later on. So really, my advice, the board needs to keep front and centre that fact that this is not a personal project anymore. It's a separate legal entity in its own right. And I think I've done some work with a charity where the founder was ready to retire and hand it on. It looked as though they took some, they handed it over nicely. But actually, 2 years later, there's an enormous legal fight going on because, looking at it in retrospect, they didn't choose very well the people they entrusted to take forward the management of the charity. But the legal documentation is extremely it's just not fit for purpose. So they now got a multi-million pound charity with two groups of people arguing about who's in control of it, and the charity commissioner involved, and they're just sitting there as well saying, well, you guys are going to end up in court unless you can agree this, because we've got conflicting bits of documentation. So I think that's the other thing, is make sure that all the arrangements are properly documented and agreed when the going is good. Because what normally happens is interims like us get called in when there's a problem, and suddenly everyone realizes there's a problem, whereas actually making sure that things are documented properly and, with proper external professional advice and so on, when it seems like there isn't a problem. I think, to me, that's the biggest bit of advice to trustees. Don't take it for granted that there won't be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's all really good advice, Nick. I suppose just to add to that, a couple of things just from my own experience of looking at governance audits as well. I think, first of all, it's really understanding what the role of the trustee is, and the skills and the experience that trustee brings, because often I think it's a confidence thing as well. Often when you're, making decisions and you're around a board with a founder at the helm of it, it can feel quite overwhelming almost, because you're kind of looking to that founder for direction. They don't necessarily know the nuances and the intricacies of what's happening operationally within the charity. So I think part of it is regaining that confidence, really understanding and appreciating that they belong there and the value they bring. I think the other thing is not to avoid it. So from my experience of advising boards, working as an interim, whether that's a CEO or a coup, the key is to address it early and directly. And it's important to get clarity on those roles, accountabilities, decision making, but also recognize that this is very much about the relational element, not just structural. I think the other thing is investing in trust, creating a space for honest conversation, because I don't think that much resource gets put into cultural governance as a whole. So sometimes bringing in an external facilitation can really help shift things. So alongside that governance clarity, there needs to be trust, honest conversation, ideally early on or before things become really entrenched. And throughout it all, keeping the focus on the mission and the long-term sustainability of the organization, not just the immediate dynamics, because often I find that you almost see the halo effect leave the founder when things start getting a bit on the verge of crisis. So in my experience, when the cash flow was going down, then it was like, right, we've got a problem. We need to start thinking about this. And often it's too late. And one really great example I had was when we had a major funder come into the room of a board meeting. And it was looking at the exit strategy of a founder, although I might argue that maybe the exit strategy wasn't great, because the founder was actually creating a role for themselves within the organization. So it's not that healthy of a departure. But the funder, a major funder, was actually almost mentoring the board in terms of, well, this is not about looking for like replacement of the founder. The founder's done a brilliant job. Now this is looking at where we need to go and what are those gaps, and almost re-educating the board and giving them that confidence that they needed to make those effective decisions.
A lot of people don't have a lot of power in these organizations, and they're often the ones that I think as interims we see really bearing the brunt of these, situations when founders kind of turn negative. So what would you just say to someone who is experiencing, proper full-blown founder syndrome in a charity?
I mean, I think there's several things. I think one of them is to actually communicate with people you trust, because what happens is people feel like they're on their own against this battle. I've seen people scared to speak a founder's name in a one-to-one with me when no one else, it was online, no one else was ever going to hear it. And yet it took 45 minutes for you to realise that this person couldn't actually say the name of the founder CEO because they were still so scared by it. So colleagues, find people you can trust, and also try to find someone you can trust on the board. That's easier said than done often. But again, it's really important. And I think the last thing I would say as well is, which might sound a bit defeatist, but I would also say to people, decide whether it's worth the fight or not, because often the founder will care more than anyone else. If there's a real battle going on, you must decide yourself whether you want to get into the battle with that person or not, because I've seen founders, do just about anything to keep control of things.
So I'd say first, it's more common than it feels, especially when they're going through a change, I'd say. I'd probably say, try to focus on what you're seeing and the impact it's having rather than jumping straight to labels. And that tends to open up better conversations. So to Nick's point, finding peers that you can connect with and that can provide you that psychological safety. So you got peers and almost allies within the organization. Don't hold it on your own. So build those allies, as Nick said, particularly at board level, although I agree it's not always easy, particularly if the board have been recruited by the founder, through the founder. And it's often, in my opinion, sometimes quite incestuous as to how much a board has been made up by the founder, and try to create structured spaces for dialogue rather than holding it informally. Focus on the behaviours and have those constructive conversations. And I'd say to any interim or a CEO coming in after a founder's been there for a significant amount of time, be mindful of your own capacity, because often as an interim, you're going in through periods of distress and transition. These situations can be emotionally demanding and quite complex.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time and for joining us on the podcast.
Wow, so many interesting things to pull out from your interviews, Felicia. I'll try and home in on a few. I think how you start out as a founder is critical. It's the hardest time to do so, but this is the time to be really intentional about how the charity will run. I think this will really sets you up for success. And I've spoken to a few founders recently, actually, who were refused charitable status by the Charity Commission in the early days. And that kind of says to me that they started with their mission, which is completely correct. But soon after that, they need to be able to think about how they're going to run the charity, develop it, and ultimately leave the charity to serve society. And a simple but powerful thought from your interviews was that founding and running and developing a charity are very different things and require very different skill sets.
Yeah, I think that question of challenge from the beginning is also really interesting. But I meet a lot of founders who really struggle to get that challenge around them from the beginning because, to be honest, they are dragging everybody to do what they know needs to be done. They're convincing people to get involved. They're, asking friends and favors, to come onto their boards. So they end up sometimes with friends and family who rubber stamp everything. But I think, it's keeping that in mind. If that's how things have started because it had to, getting that challenge and oversight in as quickly as possible is so important. And it's interesting. The last couple of weeks, I've been working with an organization where it's a founder-led organization, and it's brilliant. It has a really challenging board. It's got a really, confident and challenging SLT, and you can just see the incredible difference it makes to have those things. So, I think the other point that I think is really powerful that was made by a few of our guests today was, once you've registered as a charity, it's not your charity anymore. And thinking about that, organizations where it's seen as someone's charity might be a useful red flag to look out for.
Well, and founders come to found a charity with such emotion. So taking the emotion out of the role is obviously incredibly tricky. It's often what the charity was completely based on in the first instance. And I guess a good leadership quality in any role, and something that I see in our organisation, is to ask yourself, who is my conscience? Who will I listen to challenge my approach? Who will tell me what I don't want to but have to hear? And outside of the governance structure of the charity, potentially, it could be your chair of trustees, but they need to be the right person, really willing to give you that very open and honest view. And I love the point that this isn't all on founders' shoulders. If I was a founder listening to this today, it could feel a bit like a rather exhausting conversation. Another thing that founders need to think about and another thing that they need to be responsible for. But, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that better founder support means we'll avoid founders getting into this rather untenable place.
I do think that message that this is a systemic problem is really important. In the situations I've seen where founder syndrome has been a big problem, that complacent and complicit board has pretty much always been a fundamental enabler. And in that extreme situation I mentioned right at the outset, the funders actually were the ones who eventually took action, but it was far too late to support a positive ending. There were opportunities if they'd acted earlier that we could have actually done something more constructive. So boards have to hold founders to account just as they must any leader. And I think funders need to be on the lookout really early on for when founder syndrome starts to appear.
Yeah, I think we've got to mention funders. We've always got to mention funders, and as funders ourselves, we've been encountering this too. When we're looking at charities to strategically support, the leadership of the charity is a big area of focus. And I think a passionate founder is something that really stands out and is always a real plus. But it is a potential red flag also. And in line with a lot of what we've said on other podcasts, funders, I don't think, are just kind of fund and run. They need to be there to help the charity grow and sustain. And that could mean really tackling and challenging founders.
Yeah, and that timing question is also so important. And it's something, I totally understand why so many boards don't want to act early when we're talking about founders, but we need them to. We need boards to act early. We need funders to be engaged early. And what tends to happen is people wait until situations become critical. And that usually means that the human and the organizational damage is already significant. And I think Carla's point that burnout is going to go hand in hand with founder syndrome is really, important to acknowledge. But I also think we need to ensure we don't underestimate the emotional toll for staff, for volunteers, for trustees when they're working in those highly founders syndrome dominated charities.
Yeah, and we've had a huge amount of good conversation. I'm thinking about what point I could end on. And I think the one of the ones that will stay with me is Carla's story about the entrepreneur selling on and being set for life, and the founder moving on and being left with nothing. So it's kind of no wonder that founders syndrome does exist, and it doesn't excuse it, but maybe it does help us understand it a bit better. And ultimately, hopefully, we can do more to avoid it happening.
Let's hope so. Thanks very much to all our guests and to the Benefact Group for supporting this podcast.